1st of March 1941, First Lieutenant Ricardo Antonio Dionisio Anamat took command of the CW-21s of the Tweede Afdeling, Vliegtuiggroep 4, 2nd Squadron, Air Group 4, which I will abbreviate to VLG-4. With his command came 18 freshly arrived and assembled CW-21Bs at Umdir, 20 miles to the west of Bandung. Anamat was a native of St. Eustatius and the Leeward Islands, and was commissioned into the ML-KNIL in July 1934 with his relocation to the East Indies. It's unfortunate that his name is not better known in the annals of military history. He would come to be awarded the British Distinguished Flying Cross and the Dutch Vliegerkreuz, spending the war as a prisoner of the Japanese, before going on to have a distinguished career in the Royal Dutch Air Force. But on that March morning, he was an inexperienced pilot in the far reaches of the Dutch Empire with a brand new aircraft. In fact, only one photograph of him can be found from the pre-war times, and it took a lot of effort to obtain that. As you can see here, I also found his entry into the logbook of the KNIL and his POW data card, translated after liberation. For note, these, as well as the other photographs and documents I discovered in the research for these videos, are now available to see in the Dutch Defense Ministry archives, and if not found there, they will be available for view on my Patreon. The 4th Air Group's 1st Afdeling was outfitted with Curtiss Hawk 75s and commanded by 1st Lieutenant Max Willem van der Pol, and the 3rd Afdeling would only be formed after mobilization and the receipt of Brewster B-339s. Those are the export versions of the Buffaloes. Unlike other groups, the 4th Vliegtuiggroep reported directly to Colonel Emile Toussaint Kragen, commander of the ML-KNIL at Surabaya, and a European by blood and by birth, which is, for note, unlike many, if not most, of his men. Kragen commanded several units in Java, and he reported directly to Lieutenant General van Ooyen, inspector of the ML-KNIL and the commandant of the ML-KNIL. At the moment, it was Lieutenant Cardo Anamat's hour to mold his men of the 2nd Afdeling. Far from being obscure in any way, the Curtiss interceptors would be under the scrutiny of the highest Dutch command not in exile. With familiarizing his men with the new aircraft, developing interception tactics from scratch, and honing the combat skills of men who had likely never before seen a modern fighter, let alone flew one, Lieutenant Anamat set immediately to work with the 12 at his disposal. A total of 24 CW-21Bs had arrived. 5 were still in crates. 1 example was sent to the technical school for familiarization. 6 were kept in reserve, and 12 were assigned to active patrols. A man who kept up with the times, Lieutenant Anamat made his first action to rearrange the number of planes in each flight in the organizational table from 4 flights of 3 aircraft each, flying in Vic formation, to 4 flights of 4 aircraft flying in pairs of 2-plane elements, designed according to the German Schwarm and American Finger 4 practice, where each flight had 2 elements of a lead and a wingman flying in mutual support. In coordination with the Navy, the Dutch set about testing their own defense plans at every level. At least once every week, the Navy's Dornier DO-24s would participate as the OP-4 with the CW-21s, either escorting or intercepting the flying boats, or from time to time, Dutch Martin bombers. Interception tactics, navigation, early warning systems, radio telegraphy on the ground and the air, and the distribution of the supply system for the flying boats and bombers were all tested, so as to prepare the men of every squadron and every outpost, down to the tiniest shack on the tiniest island, for the inevitable attack. As 1941 progressed and the outbreak of the Pacific War grew closer, the CW-21's defects soon began to show. Although only a single aircraft was lost that year, a crash that also cost the pilot who had flown too low during an air show, structural damage to the light aircraft also began to appear, especially in the new landing gear. Unlike the CW-21A, which had gear folding into nacelles in the wings, the CW-21B's undercarriage folded inwards into the wing, in a manner similar to the Heinkel 100, though nearly not as sturdy. Specifically, the fittings had begun to grow weak under the stress of heavy use in the tropical air of the summer heat. The landing gear itself had minimal strutting and was of the simplest kind, thus reducing redundancy and increasing the risk of damage to the undercarriage in the event of any problems while landing. Stress folds in the skin of several aircraft also began to show, particularly in the forward fuselage behind the cowling. Without Curtiss-Wright patterns or facilities, the Dutch were forced to order new fittings and sheet metal replacements from the United States post haste. Unfortunately, the replacements order would still be aboard American freighters when the flames of war dawned across the Pacific and East Indies, limiting the number of operational CW-21s, while drilling was reduced to a minimum out of fears of losing irreplaceable aircraft due to the faulty undercarriages. By December 1941, between 9 and 16 CW-21s were operational, flying with 2 VLG-4 out of Malspati Airfield. The only source claiming 20 operational interceptors is Mars et Historia, the official historical journal of the Royal Dutch Military, and it is likely this would be the case only under ideal conditions. It is more likely that 4 flights of 4 aircraft were, to some degree, operational, just as when first deployed at Andir, with the aircraft from the reserve and those shipped as kits making up for those rendered hors de combat by mechanical or structural issues. In the first week of December 1941, the CW-21s were distributed in anticipation of a Japanese attack. 2 flights of 2 VLG-4 composed of 4 aircraft each were sent to Cililitan outside Batavia in western Java. These were ordered to train for convoy escort duty for transports coming through the Sunda Straits. Another element of 2 interceptors was sent to Surabaya to defend the port there. This left between 6 and 8 CW-21s at Madiun. The interceptors were not alone. Beginning in June 1941, the defenses of the East Indies were bolstered by the arrival of Brewster B-339 fighters, with more reinforcing the numbers in November. For note, these examples of the Brewster Buffalo were, like the earlier F-2A1 and F-2A2 models in American service, unencumbered by the heavy armor and extra fuel of the F-2A3, and were both maneuverable and speedy, able to even keep up with the Oscar when loaded with only half fuel and half ammo, to lighten wing loading. And they could even fight the Zero, although unable to match it in climbing or tight turning. The 43 B-339Ds were outfitted with the 1,200 horsepower Wright R-1820-40 Cyclone of the F-2A2. 24 B-339Cs were fitted with the less powerful 1,000 horsepower GR-1820 G105 Cyclone. These were largely deployed to Borneo in weeks before the outbreak of war, and they worked in conjunction with the CW-21s assigned to local defense, as well as the Curtiss 75s and the RAF's Hurricanes in Malaya and Sarawak. All Buffaloes were fitted with a pair of 50 caliber machine guns and a pair of 303 caliber machine guns, and had a single bomb rack under each wing for a 100-pound bomb. Although sources differ on if these were fitted in the field or were factory fitted, photographic evidence shows that they were present on the Buffaloes in the United States before being shipped overseas. A further 20 of the B-339-23 variant, also known as the B-439, were outfitted with the 1,200 horsepower Wright GR-1820 G205A, and these were given a 4-digit rather than 3-digit whole number, perhaps as a way to hide the strength of the Dutch East Indian air power. This variant was an export version of the F-2A3 and had heavier armor, bomb racks, and greater fuel capacity, but also suffered from the loss of maneuverability, which hampered American Buffaloes, and was largely disliked. These last examples were supplied to 3 VLG-4 and participated in the defense of Singapore, together with the Buffaloes of Britain and the Commonwealth. Facing the Dutch and British were the 3rd Air Army of the Japanese Army Air Force, and the Japanese Navy's 11th Air Fleet, which included the famous flock of experts of the Tainan Kokutai, and what was one of the few collaborative arrangements between the infamously antagonistic Japanese services. Under Commander Masahisa Saito, the Tainan Air Group switched from a fight over China they largely controlled to a more aggressive stance as a long-range air superiority unit. The Tainan Air Group had led the fight in the Philippines. By the close of December 1941, the Tainan Air Group's A6M Zekes were stationed at Legazpi Field. By the first half of January, they were at Zeddel Field on Jolo in the Sulu archipelago. 41 Zekes had arrived by 7th January in preparation for the invasion of the East Indies. No mention of the status of the half-dozen quads assigned to the unit is in the records. However, it may be presumed that they too stayed with the rest of the unit, even if not used in fighter operations. As with most fighter units, an additional 5 C5M Babs reconnaissance aircraft were also attached to the unit. As most Japanese fighters had their radios removed or were never fitted with them in the first place, these Babs acted as fighter director aircraft and had the responsibility of navigating the squadron and maintaining radio contact, as well as performing reconnaissance duty. The 11th Air Fleet also included the elite Kanoya Air Group, the Takeo Air Group, Genzan Air Group, Mihoro Air Group, and 1st Air Group. The Kanoya Air Group contributed 3 Chutai of G4M Betty bombers, for a total of 27 aircraft based out of Saigon at the beginning of the war, then Davao in the Philippines. The Takeo Air Group were stationed on Zeddel Field on Jolo with the Tainan Air Group, and had 54 Betties. The Genzan Air Group contributed 36 G3M Nells, while the Mihoro Air Group added another 36 Nells. The 1st Air Group had 36 Nells and 24 A5M Claws. The Navy had also sent the carrier Ryujo to the area. Having played a relatively minor role in the battle for Davao, she added 12 Claws and 14 Kates to the Japanese order of battle. However, no torpedoes with the Kates were carried due to supply shortages and maintenance issues. It was not only the Kates that were forced to operate without torpedoes. The Nells and Betties also only had bombs. Torpedoes were prioritized for the Eastern, Southern, and Central Pacific operations. In addition to Ryujo, seaplane carriers allocated included the sister ships Chitose and Mizuho, with 24 aircraft each, as well as 14 aircraft aboard Kamikawa Maru. You can see my video I did all about her, and 8 each aboard Sagara Maru, Sanuki Maru, and Sanyo Maru. Most of those embarked were Mitsubishi F1M2 Peeps, while smaller numbers of the excellent Aichi E13A1 Jake were also carried. The 3rd Air Army was composed of the 3rd, 7th, and 12th Air Brigades, or Hikodan, comparable to a wing, and 2 reconnaissance sentai, or squadrons. The 3rd and 7th Hikodan had a single fighter sentai and 3 bomber sentai each. The 12th Hikodan had 2 fighter sentai. Though there were tensions between the 25th Army and the 3rd Air Army, as the ground forces felt the air service was not giving them the ground support they needed, by this point in the war, the 3rd Air Army was used as an independent force for all intents and purposes, especially in the campaign to come. The 2 primary fighter units facing the Dutch, British, and other allies were the 59th Sentai of the 3rd Hikodan and the 64th Sentai of the 7th Hikodan. The 59th Sentai had been the first to be equipped with the Ki-43 Oscar. However, they were hampered in the initial months of the war by the loss of their commanding officer, Major Ryunosuke Tanimura. He had been killed in a mid-air collision near Nakhon in northeastern Thailand on 13 December. Alongside the 59th in the fight for Burma and East Asia was the 64th Sentai. Also outfitted with the Ki-43 Oscar, this unit was expertly led by Tateo Kato, who had been an army pilot since 1925 and was considered one of the best flight instructors, taking on this role at the age of 25 in 1928. He had flown Perries against the Soviets at Taiyuan and was an ace 3 times over by the time he was sent to the Army Staff College, assigned to the General Staff, and sent to Europe to observe the Luftwaffe. In a military society defined by nepotism, slow advancement, and the shunning of individual honors, he was clearly amongst the Japanese Army Air Force's elite. The famous film, Kato Hayabusa Sentotai, was based on his life. The Japanese Army's 3 other fighter Sentai flew the Ki-27 Nate. These were the 1st, 11th, and 77th Sentai, and were tasked largely with convoy escort duty and patrols rather than being used as a striking force against the Allies. Though all had seen combat in China, and the 1st and 11th had also been a Halcyon goal against the Soviets. The 4 medium bomber Sentai were the 12th, 60th, 62nd, and 98th. In contrast to the pursuit units, with the exception of the 12th Sentai, these were largely made of inexperienced crews. The 12th Sentai, however, was made of veterans of China and Halcyon goal. Combined, these Sentai offered a total of 120 Ki-21 2A Sally bombers. Additionally, 2 light bomber Sentai, the 75th and 90th, flew the Kawasaki Ki-48 Lily. While both had combat experience, neither had combat experience while flying the Lily. 2 Sentai, the 27th and 31st, flew the Mitsubishi Ki-30 An light bomber. Small detachments flew the Mitsubishi Ki-15 Babs, which was the Army version of the C5M2 Babs. These Sentai also had the Ki-46 Dyna, which was an excellent recon platform with incredible speed and flight ceiling that put her beyond the range of Allied interceptors, and the Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonia, an updated version of the Ki-30 with some armor and better handling, as well as the Tachikawa Ki-36, an Army cooperation aircraft of the simplest type that was slow, unarmored, and vulnerable to any kind of opposition. This amounted to approximately 60 Oscars, 90 Nates, 120 Sallys, 60 Lilies, 60 Ans, and a handful of recon and Army co-op aircraft available for the Army, plus 41 Zekes, 42 Claudes, 14 Kates, 5 Fabs, 81 Betties, 108 Nells, and 86 float planes in theater, give or take for reserves. By comparison, the Dutch air fleets were outdated, flown by pilots with limited flight time and no opportunities for combat, and who had responsibility for an immense area. To their north, the Commonwealth aircraft were likewise piloted by largely inexperienced crews, though some squadrons had seen combat in North Africa. The fleet on the Malay Peninsula included modern Bristol Blenheims, the workhorse Lockheed Hudson, and over 50 Hurricanes, reinforced with another 48 on 9 January. A handful of CAC Riverways even made it to the RAAF on Malaya. The force also included the outdated Wildebeest biplane torpedo bomber and 120 Brewster Buffaloes, to which more weight had been added when fuel and ammunition allocations limited, further diminishing performance and combat efficacy. Few of these would survive the onslaught in Malaya, and fewer still the fall of Singapore. In plain terms, the Allied pilots often flew off with insufficient fuel, limited ammunition, and no combat experience, into what was an inevitable and absolute massacre. Those who did survive were evacuated to Sumatra as Singapore fell. One force bolstering the defense of the East Indies came from the U.S. Army Air Forces in the form of aircraft and crews fleeing the Philippines, as well as redirected reinforcements, which had been destined to the Philippines, but did not arrive in time to face the Japanese onslaught. Unfortunately, most of those would not make it to the Indies until between late January and mid-February. The Dutch were facing an enemy with plenty of experience in the air, respected leadership, and a flood of resources available to them from French Indochina, Thailand, and in the coming weeks, captured bases on the Malay Peninsula and northern Borneo. When war broke out, every preventive measure had to be taken to ensure that defending the Indies would not be an absolute bloodbath. The Japanese poured over Malaya by land and sea on the first day of the war, and were closing day by day towards Singapore. From the beginning, the defenses of the East Indies kicked into action. Dutch assets focused on convoy protection, especially for shipping passing through the Sunda Straits en route to Singapore. For this purpose, fighters were at Kilajati and Chulilitop, both near Batavia, and Palembang in South Sumatra, blocking flight hours and putting harsh demands on maintenance crews at the 3 air bases, as flights flew back and forth, sometimes every other day, to protect inbound and outbound convoys, while British fighters tried in vain to protect the skies over the Malay Peninsula. The Japanese advanced along each coast, taking the cities, villages, and transportation hubs with ease. Although the Dutch had declared war on Japan after Pearl Harbor, and Japanese airstrikes against Dutch oil industry, seaplane bases, and air bases at Tarakan, Lake Tondano, and elsewhere had all taken place, Japan did not reciprocate with the declaration of war until the morning of 11 January, at the same time as their forces were landing on Tarakan on Borneo and at Manado on Celebes, adding those airfields to their assets in advance of their assaults farther south 2 weeks later. Days after the declaration of war against the Netherlands, airstrikes began against Palembang and South Sumatra. On 15 January, a group of 27 Japanese bombers was spotted heading towards Palembang. Immediately, 2 flights of 4 CW-21s each, 10 Curtiss Hawks, and 14 Brewster B-339Ds were scrambled. This was to be the first combat sortie of the CW-21. Unfortunately, no contact was made. Loaded for bear and searching for a baptism of fire, the interceptors, as well as the others, all returned to Palembang empty-handed. That afternoon, the CW-21s were ordered to Chulilitop, never to return to Sumatra. By the middle of January, Malacca was taken, and Malaya north of Johor was in Japanese hands. The British chose largely to withdraw rather than fight, saving their forces for what they felt would be a victory at Singapore. Meanwhile, British Borneo, Sarawak, and Brunei fell, despite the efforts of Dutch Dornier Do-24Ks and B-10s, and the successes of the submarine K-14 against the convoy headed for Kuching on Sarawak, in which the submarine ruined 1 transport, sunk 2, damaged a 4th, and took with them hundreds of Japanese troops. While 30 miles north, submarine K-16 sunk the destroyer Zagari. By the end of December, it was clear that the Dutch East Indies were next in the sights of the expanding Japanese Empire. The Japanese had already begun bombing Dutch bases on Borneo, although not in any determined way, but air-to-air fights had not yet occurred, save for a flying boat downed by a Pete floatplane. With the bulk of reinforcements arriving no faster than a freighter could bring them, it would turn out that the British and Americans would provide the bulk of the aircraft present on Java, though more often than not, each nation's forces acted completely independently, contrary to the collaboration envisioned by the American-British Dutch-Australian, or ABDA, command. At the onset of the campaign, Singosari Airfield near Malang hosted, in addition to Dutch forces, some RAF craft and the bulk of the American Army Air Forces units. With the Martin bombers at Mauspati, also near Malang, were units from the American 19th Bomb Group, including the 28th, 93rd, and 30th Bombardment Squadrons, with B-17s, and smaller numbers of B-24s and LB-30s. On 13 and 14 January, the 5th Bomber Command Headquarters Squadron and the 9th, 11th, 14th, and 22nd Bomb Squadrons of the 7th Bomb Group would arrive. Although some of their craft remained in Australia, their home following the departure from the Philippines, most found their way to Java. Many of these B-17s on hand were of the newer B-17E variant, which offered a redesigned fuselage accompanied by increased speed and greater defensive armament, including a new tailgun position. As a side note, for daily activities of the U.S. Army Air Forces in the Dutch East Indies campaign, please check out the relevant episodes of Walk Through the War for January through March of 1942. Unfortunately, the American fortresses and liberators were forced to park outside of the protective revetments on their bases due to their size. This only made them both easily visible to Japanese reconnaissance and all the more vulnerable to attack. At Kemayoran, outside Batavia at the time, though now located in the heart of the city, 2 Fairey Albacores and 5 Vickers Wildebeests of 36 Squadron RAF were stationed under the command of Squadron Leader J.T. Wilkins, and 8 more Wildebeests of 100 Squadron arrived on 31st January, following their valiant fight against the Japanese invasion of their home base at Singapore and against the Japanese fleet at Endau on the Malay Peninsula. Here we see 2 of their Wildebeests over Singapore in a pre-war photo. Much to the discontent of No. 100 Squadron's pilots and crew, they would be folded into 36 Squadron as Q-Flight for the remainder of the fight. The Wildebeests gave up torpedo bombing in exchange for 250-pound bombs and prepared to face yet another Japanese invasion fleet. RAF and ANZAC units fleeing Singapore after evacuation were ordered to be at Palembang, where there were 2 airfields. The main installation, P-1, a major airbase known to the Japanese, and a smaller installation known as P-2. P-2 would not be discovered by the Japanese until the campaign was nearly ended. The Dutch had divided Java into 3 sections, East, West, and Central, with air and ground units assigned to each sector. In defense of East Java, especially at the naval base at Surabaya, was the 4th Air Group, the Vierde Vliegtuiggroup. All 3 Afdelingen were based at Malspati Airfield near Madiun, with the 1st Afdeling having 12 Hawk 75 A7s, the 2nd Afdeling having 16 CW-21Bs, and the 3rd Afdeling having Brewster B-339Ds and manned largely from school personnel. These were reinforced at the end of January after the outbreak of direct hostilities by the dozen P-40Es of the American Provisional 17th Pursuit Squadron, based at the secret airstrip Blimbing, outside of Byombang. Like P-2, the P-40s were thankfully protected by the secrecy of their base, as the facility was completely unknown to the Japanese, just as the Dutch had planned in the late 30s. At Ambon's Laha Airfield, as previously mentioned, there were 4 Brewster B-339Ds of the Ambon Patrolles. At the outbreak of war, the 3 Afdelingen of the 5th Aircraft Group were equipped with Brewsters and based at Semplak Airfield near Buitenzorg on Java, with the exception of the 1st Afdeling. The 1st and 2nd Patrolles of the 1st Afdeling were based at Samarinda II, and the 3rd Patrolle was based at Sengkawang II, both located on Dutch Borneo. The 2nd Afdeling fought alongside the British at Singapore from Christmas Day through 18 January, but were then withdrawn back to Semplak and reformed with the 11 or 12 remaining Buffaloes of the 17 with which they had departed. Bolstering defenses, reconnaissance Afdelingen were formed in November from disbanded training units and were tasked with scouting and army cooperation. As all schools had been shut down upon mobilization, instructors, supplementary aircrew, ground crew, administration, and flight students were all assigned to combat units. The Marine Luchtvaartdienst added to the mix Dornier Dio 24Ks and Catalina flying boats, as well as Fokker D-4A floatplanes and Fokker C-11W shipboard aircraft. The Navy's flying school at Surabaya also boasted a half-dozen Dornier Vals, 10 Dornier 24K1s, another Fokker T4A, a half-dozen Fokker C-14Ws, 30 PBY Catalinas, and 40 Ryan STMs. Of January, the Japanese had remained in place as they geared up for their offensive against Singapore, and for their drive into the southern reaches of Borneo and Celebes. The siege of the Bataan Peninsula and preparations for the drive into New Britain and the Solomons also tied up assets, as did the first stages of the invasion of Burma and the extension of supply lines to meet the demands of the Pacific War. On 11 January, the day Kuala Lumpur fell, and Japan declared war against the Netherlands, the Japanese offensive southward commenced. The Dutch and Japanese had already exchanged some blows, and the oil-rich island of Tarakan on the border of Dutch Borneo and British North Borneo had already been the target of Tainan Air Group since 30 December. As war was declared, Tarakan was quickly assaulted by Japanese amphibious forces. One of the largest oil production locations in the East Indies, Tarakan alone could fuel a peacetime Japan's oil needs. As the Japanese landed, expectations of capturing a hoard of much-needed oil were dashed, when troops were instead greeted with the choking smoke and biting flames of 700 oil wells and their associated pipelines and refineries, all set to the torch by the Dutch forces enforcing a scorched earth policy. Despite Martin bombers attacking the invasion beaches and the steadfast defense of the Dutch forces, the island was surrendered the next morning. The last units to receive word of the surrender only did so after sinking 2 Japanese minesweepers and a landing craft with their coastal artillery. In response to the sinkings, 215 of 911 POWs would be executed by decapitation or by being drowned at sea in the crocodile-infested waters. The oil fires would not be extinguished for 5 months, and only for oil production to be impaired again only 14 months later by Allied bombers whose raids would continue until the Japanese surrender in 1945. Oil was not the only important reason to capture Tarakan. A mere 4 days later, on 16 January, the Zekes of Tainan Air Group called Tarakan's airfield home. The Japanese now had a base from which their invasion of mainland Borneo could be supported, as well as could future advances on Celebes and Sumatra, thanks to the A6M2's incredible range, now placing nearly the entire theater under the shadow of the Zero. Not quite 2 weeks after seizing Tarakan and only 4 days after the British surrendered North Borneo, the Japanese advanced once more down the Makassar Strait, landing once again amongst burning oil fields as they struck Balikpapan on 23 January. As the invasion fleet approached in the early morning hours, Dutch and American submarines successfully hit the invasion fleet from below the waves, and the ML-KNIL sent waves of Martin bombers and their dozen Brewster escorts to hit them from above. Submarine attacks continued and the naval battle raged to the 23rd and 24th as the American cruisers Boise and Marblehead, together with 6 destroyers, struck at the transport fleet in what was one of the few successful Allied engagements of the campaign. Despite these small glimmers of hope, it was clear that the crimson shadow waxed over the East Indies. On the 23rd and 24th of January, Balikpapan and Kandari fell to the Japanese in a combined air and amphibious offensive. That same day, airstrikes against Ambon stepped up in preparation for the invasion of that island on 30 January. On Borneo, resistance in the jungles and mountains of Sarawak continued through to April. Around 29 January, Pontianak fell to the Japanese. On 30 January, the entire Tainan Air Group moved to Balikpapan in advance of the assault on eastern Java, joining with the 3rd Air Group to combine efforts against Java. Soon, fighter sweeps were flown over Malang and Surabaya as a matter of routine. The Dutch counted 65 fighters and 45 Martin bombers on Java, based at Andir, Julelitan, Chisok, Semplak, Marion, Pendran Parak, and a single afterling of Martins at Maspati, which then moved to Milan. Brewsters took up the defense of Batavia and the western portions of Java. The CW-21s of 2 VLG-4 found themselves back where they were initially meant to be, in defense of Surabaya on eastern Java. The interceptors were based at Tanjung Perak. The airbase belonged to the Navy, though it was ML-KNIL's obligation to provide the aircraft for the defense of the crucial port. Placed under the command of the Navy's Commander Luchtverteidigung Surabaya, or CLS, 2 VLG-4 boasted 14 operational Curtiss interceptors. However, despite several scramble missions against reports of Japanese bombers, not one of them had yet to encounter the enemy through the month of January. As February dawned, the Japanese renewed offensive would change that. On the 1st of February, multiple Japanese reconnaissance flights flew over Surabaya, Malang, and Maspati. The Japanese sought out what assets were available for destruction as their air campaign against Java began. CLS ordered 12 of the 14 CW-21Bs to be kept at ready status at all times, prepared to scramble at the very notice of any incoming Japanese strike. On 2nd February, the A6M Zekes of the 3rd Kokutai moved from Kendari to the captured airfields at Balikpapan in southeast Borneo. Led by Lieutenant Tomotsu Yokoyama, they joined the Tainan Air Group, commanded by Commander Masahiro Saito. The 2 unit Zekes would participate in the offensive from their new base, poised only 500 miles from Surabaya, about half the operational range of the A6M2 Zeke with the drop tank, or at the extreme range of their internal fuel load, with about a half hour of combat time, or 100 miles worth of fuel, to spare. That same day, the Tainan Air Group's fighters conducted a sweep over eastern Java with the goal of clearing any opposition from proximity of Surabaya. Having scrambled earlier in the day in an attempt to intercept Japanese reconnaissance flights of C-5Ms from the 3rd Kokutai, the CW-21s, together with the rest of the units in the CLS, were on the ground during the midday fighter sweep, safe from engaging the superior Japanese numbers, though it would have inevitably been a massacre. The ability for the Japanese to reach Surabaya without being spotted demonstrated the early warning system for eastern Java was sorely lacking in coverage. Japanese tended to approach from the Makassar Strait rather than over Borneo, especially as Balikpapan was not suited for bomber operations, and Japanese bombers continued to operate from Kendari. This path avoided where recently trained indigenous and Dutch civilian spotters added to the already organized spotting units of the Observation Corps, KNIL Reserve, KNIL Regular Forces, and naval outposts. This meant that nearly no warning was offered to the Curtiss interceptors at Surabaya by the time a report was received and pilots were scrambled. It was both the situation for which the plane was designed and the worst possible situation at which to find one's only lines of defense. Despite the worsening weather on the afternoon and night of the 2nd, on 3rd February, Japanese bombers began their assault against facilities on Java. Beginning at 0630 Batavia time, 2 hours behind Japanese military time, 19 Betties of the 1st Kokutai 3rd Attack Unit, led by Lieutenant Commander Osaki Takeo, took off from Kendari, bound for Malang, with Denpasar and Bali as a secondary target. At 0710 hours, 27 G3M Nells of the Kanoya Kokutai, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Irisa Toshiie, took off to strike at the airfields in and around Marion. At 0757, 26 G3M Betties of the Takeo Air Group, led by Lieutenant Commander Nonaka Taru, took off from Kendari for Surabaya Airfield and naval facilities. At 0715, 27 A6M20s of the 3rd Kokutai's 1st Fighter Unit took off from Balikpapan under the command of Lieutenant Yokoyama Tomotsu to escort the bombers. With them were the unit's 2 C5M Babs Recon Fighter Director planes. All in all, the first wave strike force totaled 27 Zeros, escorting 72 bombers. Accompanying them in the assault were the Tainan Air Group's fighter sweep force of 31 Zeros and 2 Babs. The first group of 17 Zeros and a single C5M Babs of the 2nd Fighter Unit sortied from Balikpapan at 0700, led by Lieutenant Maseo Asai on a fighter sweep over Marion. At 0715, the 3rd Fighter Unit's 14 Zeros and another Babs, destined for their fighter sweep and strafing missions to Malang, took off, led by Lieutenant Hideki Shingo. From Kendari, the flight to East Java should take 3 hours 45 minutes for the Betties and 4.5 hours for the Nells. The fighters would arrive first to sweep the area, followed by the first bombers over their targets at approximately 10:15 hours. The first loss of the day would not be long in coming. The B-17C 40-2062 of the 30th Bomb Squadron 19th Bomb Group, flown by Captain Ray Cox out of Singosari, was on a test flight north of the island. Cox was shot down while returning to base. Japanese escorts caught him unaware and downed the bomber, killing all aboard. For the time being, he is marked missing. The wreckage will be found the next day, 20 miles north of the airfield. Though alleged to have happened at 0930, this would put the incident too early in the day, as the first Japanese aircraft were not seen until about this time, and they were spotted much farther east. However, it was the first loss of the day, and likely happened between 0930 and 1000 hours. It was indeed the spotters on Medora Island who first saw the incoming aircraft. The 3rd Kokotai Zeros, speeding ahead of the first wave of bombers at about 0945, or just before. The Dutch immediately signaled as scramble alerts in East Java and launched 25 fighters to counter the incoming Japanese aircraft. 100 hours, 3 flights of CW-21Bs sortied with orders to climb to altitude and patrol the 3 adjacent patrol sectors around Surabaya, to which the flights had been assigned. This was exactly the kind of mission for which the interceptors had been designed, and it was time for Animat to see his plans put into action. At the same time, 7 Hawk 75s of the first offdeling of VLG-4 also went aloft, with a heading toward the incoming Japanese. The air raid sirens in the city of Surabaya were set off at 10:15 hours, putting into effect the civil defense plans rigorously practiced by the civilian population, and the city went into lockdown as the drone of Japanese engines grew on the horizon. Before 10:30 hours, a half-dozen U.S. Army Air Force P-40Es from the 17th Pursuit Squadron Provisional sortied to join the fight. Japanese bombers had reached their targets within the half hour, commencing attacks at their respective targets between 10:30 and 10:45, followed soon afterwards by the Tainan Air Group Zeros on their strike missions. Despite the considerable size of the force sent to meet the enemy, each flight of CW-21s acted independently, and any potential benefit that would have come from mutual support and collaboration was forfeited, a trend notably symptomatic of the defense of the East Indies. As commanding officer of 2 VLG-4, First Lieutenant Animat commanded 4 interceptors in one flight. The second flight was led by Second Lieutenant J. Kingma. The third flight was under the command of First Lieutenant Willem August Bedde. Bedde would later go on to reach the rank of colonel and command a squadron in the New Guinea confrontation in 1958 to 1962. At that time, he lived in Javastrad 46 in Bandung and was about to face the enemy on its way to destroy his homeland. Two VLG-4's second flight was the first into the fray and saw the most action that day. Lieutenant Kingma and Sergeants Hai, Halbersat, and Hogenes flew towards their patrol station immediately over Surabaya and their own base of Tanjung Perak. They sortied in a staggered formation of 2 elements, a variation Animat had drilled into them in imitation of tactics in Europe, which were so effective against the 3-plane Vic formation, abandoned by the RAF, yet still used by the Japanese. The forward element was led by Lieutenant Kingma, with Sergeant L.H. Hai as his wingman. The initials HM are also seen, however the Netherlands Institute of Military History has assured me that this is a mistake due to Hendrik Marinosaya, a bomber pilot with one BLG-2, who was killed the same day. The rank corporal is also seen, and this was because he was no stranger to the brig. However, it does appear he had regained his rank by that day. The aft element was composed of Sergeants Robert Christian Hab Halberstadt and Johannes Hogenes. The Curtiss interceptors had only just reached altitude and were over the Madura Strait heading towards the point between Frisi and Radora when they were surprised by 16 Zekes dumping them from 6 o'clock high. Hichas slammed his rudder and ailerons into a tight bank to port, but the aft element did not react quickly enough to follow him. This put the two aft aircraft into the sights of a flight of Zeros. With a burst of Japanese fire from the leading Zekes, a shocked Hogenes was torn to shreds before the Japanese even pulled out of their dive. Halberstadt was quicker on the stick, and he quickly banked to starboard and put a Zero in his sights, only to be shot down in turn. It was now 2 against 16. He was hit by machine gun rounds, but again pulled hard on the stick, turning into the Japanese fighters and quickly getting them into his sights and opening fire. He claimed 2 Zeros shut down. His luck would change when he maneuvered into a firing position on a third Zero, only to be hit in the empennage by machine gun fire from a group of 12 coming in from his starboard. His craft quickly began to burn, likely from incendiary fire, and he flung open the canopy and bailed out before the fire could spread. He landed safely in the outskirts of Surabaya, although his body was covered in severe burns. He was wingman Sergeant Haya, flying CW-345, or shown erroneously here flying CW-360, shot down a Zeke only to himself then receive enemy fire from his port side, which destroyed his hydraulics. The CW-21 was seen as a flimsy craft because of the narrow, tactful shape and lack of armor, but she withstood the barrage of rifle-caliber lead well. Haya likely received no cannon fire, as this would have destroyed almost any single-engine aircraft. The 7.7mm rounds had not damaged the control surfaces of his aircraft. Oil covered his windscreen and seeped into his cockpit, already slimy with hydraulic fluid. He was practically blind, but he was in control. Choosing not to bail out, he quickly banked and dove for speed, breaking away from the Zeros. Deciding Perak was too dangerous, and knowing he would not make it to the air bases around Milan, he instead headed to the secret airstrip in Ngoro, 25 miles south-southwest of Surabaya, a tiny village then in the foothills beneath Mount Penanggungan's northern slopes. Keeping low over the terrain and trusting his senses and what little he could see to guide him, I managed to navigate in this precarious condition for what must have been the tensest 7 to 10 minutes of his life. With no hydraulics, he lowered his landing gear manually by the auxiliary hydraulic hand pump and safely landed his crippled interceptor in what was a perfect example of calmness under fire and superior piloting. Now, this is only one half of the battle account. In fact, all 4 aircraft were likely engaged and destroyed or damaged by warrant officers Tadaaki Akamatsu, but we'll get to that when we sum up the events and claims of the day. You should know me well enough by now that there is no way I only consulted Dutch records, as difficult as it may be to find others. Hilo's incredible combat debut was Sergeant Halberstadt's wife, Nell. They had only been married for 3 months. Having heard the air raid siren on her way to her job in town as a courier, she was pulled into a trench with other civilians huddling in fear of Japanese bombs. She watched as the interceptors took off, saw the Japanese pounce, and, in paralysis, watched the dogfight, keeping her eyes on her husband's mount. She saw him open fire on a Zero, only to see then his fuselage raked with fire when a Japanese 20mm cannon shell spread his right into a flaming torch, diving heedlessly into the East Indian terrain. In her first moments of her impending widowhood, Nell Halberstadt passed out. She would wake up in hospital only to hear her physician inform her that they were both in good health. Her, and the child she learned that moment she was carrying. Rob was 23, Nell was 22. The next morning, Squadron Commander Anamat visited her with the news that her husband was officially missing. However, no sign of him nor of his aircraft has ever been seen. He then handed Nell her husband's identity disc. He had thrown it from his cockpit, and it had been, almost miraculously, found. He held on to this for the rest of her life. Decades later, Nil Halberstadt, Raider Nil Mercier-Offling, recalled the fight in a BBC interview for the Oral History People's War project. P.C. Bohr, who is perhaps the best author when it comes to Dutch East Indies military affairs, confirmed it was Haya that downed the Zero, not Halberstadt. But it may be the case that Nil Halberstadt saw her husband open fire on a Zero and damage it. 74 years after the event, on 29th April 2016, at the Deesvaluvenberg estate of the Inspector General of the Armed Forces in Hilversum, Lieutenant General Bart Hoyetink, Inspector General, awarded Sergeant Pilot Robert Christian Halberstadt the Mobilization War Cross for his spirit of self-sacrifice in the fight of the Netherlands East Indies. This belated recognition was presented to Halberstadt's granddaughters, his grandchildren through his daughter Roberta, the daughter of whom Nell Halberstadt first learned the day she lost her husband, and whom was thus named in his memory. Farther west, Lieutenant Animat's flight patrolled at first without encountering the enemy. Animat was joined by his wingman, Sergeant Fritz von Balen, and the second element, Sergeants Franz Bierling and Nikolaos Dejan. As the first sortie that day, they had reached the patrol area and began circling, while to their east and out of visual range, 16 Zeros had detached from their escorting duties to duke it out with Lieutenant Kingma's flight. This action left only 11 A6Ms available to continue their fighter sweep of East Java while the bombers reached their targets. Animat's position and timing were perfect for intercepting bombers coming in from occupied Borneo. However, Japanese bombers were operating out of Celebes, putting their approach over Madura Island rather than the Java Sea. With no early warning systems in place in this sector, and no radar available whatever, Animat stayed on what would be a peaceful patrol on a day that was anything but peaceful. Although the action was out of his visual range, he could hear it over his wireless. In the build-up to war, several East Indian spies for the Japanese had infiltrated many of the units in the ML-KNIL, and the Japanese were aware of the frequencies used by the Dutch. One infiltrator who had left the East Indies before the outbreak of hostilities was participating in the raid that day, and he taunted Lieutenant Animat over the radio while the interceptors were climbing. The trader's voice laughed over the airways as he cried out in Dutch, "We zijn al already stopped. We're already over the city." The Japanese were indeed over the city, as seen here in footage of the bombing of Surabaya. This appears to be the footage of the first wave to take off that morning, yet the last wave to arrive over the target, that of the G3M Nells of the Knoya Kokutai, aiming for the airfields at and around Marion, and led by Lieutenant Commander Risa Toshiie. One can see the tail markings on the escorting A6M2s, showing them to be from the Tainan Air Group. Circling over their patrol quadrant, the fuel began to run low, and Animat ordered the flight to return to base at Tanjong Perak. As they descended and flew south, he saw the silhouettes of Japanese bombers high above them at their usual bombing altitude of Angels 1-5. These were very likely the Nells seen in the Japanese newsreel. Animat had intended to refuel and engage the enemy, but he did not know that the bombers had just severely damaged his airstrip. Turning in towards Tanjong Perak, the first element, Lieutenant Animat and Sergeant von Balen, approached to land in turn, while the second element continued to circle and wait for their turn to land. Touching ground, Animat was suddenly thrust forward in his instrument panel. His aircraft, CW-343, had struck a bomb crater on the runway. Safe but rattled, he looked behind him to see Sergeant von Balen's aircraft, CW-349. Von Balen was preparing to land, had his undercarriage down, and his engine throttled back, and several Zeros behind him, their guns opening up and blazing as rounds dashed into von Balen and the dust of the airstrip. Losing control of his craft only a few feet above the ground, the nose of von Balen's interceptor jumped, crashing into the airstrip, killing him instantly. The Japanese climbed back to altitude, almost miraculously missing the two circling interceptors waiting to land. Sergeant Bierling at the helm of CW-360 came in on the tail of the climbing Zeros and emptied his guns at them. The Zeros did not respond, and both he and Sergeant Diale landed safely. But there was no victories for that flight that day, only the loss of 2 machines and 1 highly valuable pilot. First Lieutenant Willem Albers Badet, flying CW-354, took off in a Vic formation of 3 aircraft and headed for their patrol quadrant. The flight was led by Badet, and he was joined by Sergeant Otto Berger Roemimper and Francis Johannes Brouwer. Roemimper lived at Lincolnweg Brewster 16 in Bandung at the time, not far from Badet. These men were clearly joined in much more than just their service. One note here about the rank I just named, Vandrich. It was an intermediate grade for officer candidates. It liked the German Fähnrich, which it also shares an etymological root, but it was also not quite just for officer candidates. In fact, several of the sergeants I may have mentioned in the video so far may have held the rank of Fähnrich. However, like I said, different authors call them ensign, warrant officer, sergeant, and with little consistency. Even reference books are nearly indiscriminate with their usage. The inestimable Guido Rossellini was in error, showing a warrant officer rank with a single silver button-shaped stud, although there was no such insignia, and the Vandrich, or cornet for the mounted branches, wore a single gold stud in European forces, both before and after 1940. Luckily, one may say the ranks of lieutenants were very clear, and I made sure of that when writing. With Vandrich, it's not always easy to see who was what, at what time, and when they were what they were, if they ever were in the first place. So even Japanese records are not quite clear. If one were to describe the chaos of the 1939 to 1942 period in the Dutch East Indies military, the nature of what a Vandrich is may stand as a glowing piece of evidence of a force in flux. Now, today, Vandrich refers to the highest rank of officer candidate or cadet. At the time, however, only one rank of officer candidate existed, and candidates were expected to be in active service, unlike cadets who are in a school or academy. Vandrich was often classed amongst officers, but it was officially graded as the highest rank of NCO in Europe, as seen in this handbook. Even the insignia is not illustrated, whereas officer ranks are. However, in unit organizational charts, in European forces as well as in the Indies, they're placed amongst officers in every way. In the East Indian Armed Forces, as they were completely independent of European forces, the confusion is incredible. The proper insignia was a silver stud and a gold stud, the foremost stud being gold. Rossignoli does this correctly in his chart of pre-1942 insignia. However, he puts the studs side by side in the 1942 chart, and in a position that on a collar the aft stud is incorrectly depicted as gold. Here he calls the rank ensign, describing it as amongst the officers as he also does with warrant officer, his translation of an adjutant Unteroffizier. He places the pre-1942 insignia on the black collar patch of an enlisted man, which I see no reference to either way in Dutch sources, so it could be correct. He ignores the rank of Onderleutnant altogether. So why do I pick on poor Guido? Well, because he's considered amongst the greatest and most comprehensive experts on the matter, together with Andrew Molo. Since rank tells so much about authority, training, and what is expected of a person in the armed forces, I kind of made this an important part of my research. I had to go look up in Dutch and Dutch East Indian documents to learn what the heck I was reading. And so I don't blame Rossignoli nor any of the other authors for mistakes in how they portray this rank. Yet, as shown in my chart here of the unique rank structure in the East Indian Armed Forces, Vandrich was inferior to the unique KNIL rank of Onderleutnant and superior to Adjutant Onderoffizier, both of which were somewhat like the Commonwealth Warrant Officer, which the RAF only had one of at the time. However, Avandrich had officer privileges and authority over all NCOs and other ranks, even over the Unterleutnant. Furthermore, it seems to have been treated as a kind of sub-lieutenant rather than a true candidacy position. Avandrich was neither fish nor fowl, and difficult to compare to American ranks, and even more difficult to compare to Commonwealth ranks. Therefore, one may see Brouwer and the others called a sergeant sometimes rather than a Vandrich, and this applies to others as well. It's also often the case that they were promoted in the field, promoted after being captured, or promoted upon liberation. And I mean no disrespect where this is concerned, but I felt it was worth mentioning as just one sign among countless others that shows how rapidly the Dutch were evolving since the shadow of war first crept over them, and even how details as simple as rank, command authority, and officer privilege could be added to the growing pile of what were the growing pains of an Air Force desperate to reach the modern age. And for comparison, look at the Japanese, who, in terms of rank, privilege, authority, and every other means of military discipline, were of a vastly different character, defined by strict discipline and absolute obedience to military order. So with that cleared, get back to the action. As with Lieutenant Kingma's flight, vedettes would also have little time between taking off and meeting their enemy, as several Zeros pounced on the climbing interceptors. Despite their best efforts, none of the men managed to reach their patrol area, let alone score even a single hit against the Japanese. By the time Vedette was taking off with his men, Kingma's flight was already engaged, and Animat was leading his patrol farther west. Japanese bombers were over Medora Island, not yet over Surabaya. It is not clear if Vedette could see Kingma's flight being engaged, or if it was simultaneous with his departure, but the timing could not have been worse. Only minutes after takeoff, Zeke fighters descended on Vedette, Rumimper, and Brouwer. The three were in Vic formation, flying east by southeast, and the Japanese were in a perfect position to attack. The first hit was Lieutenant Vedette himself. Dodging Japanese bullets and cannon shells, he soon felt the scorch of several Japanese 7.7mm rounds tear into him. A single 20mm shell tore through his windshield and out the port side of his canopy without exploding, but sending glass and shrapnel into his chest and left arm. Diving back towards his airstrip with barely any strength in his lower limbs, he not only evaded further engagement with the Japanese, but landed safely, albeit in a belly landing, and was lifted out of his cockpit by his ground crew, and scurried off to medical care and away from the Japanese fighters determined to destroy him and his aircraft as they strafed the airfield. Rumimper was next. Warned by Brouwer, who was in the aftmost position of the formation, he took rounds to his port wing. The Japanese had torn up his aircraft and he had been hit by bullet fragments, but not severely. He was able to maneuver his craft with great skill and escape the dogfight, evading the Japanese fighters despite all odds. Unfortunately, he could not make it back to base, and had to perform an emergency landing at Nagoro, just as Sergeant Haya of Kingman's flight had done. Rumimper, too, would safely land despite extensive damage to his aircraft and his injured state. Brouwer would also manage to evade the Japanese despite taking heavy damage, with what can only be called extremely lucky and impeccable timing. As he took fire to his wing, he emptied his fuel tank before it exploded, pulled back on the stick, and pushed the throttle to the wall, climbing as fast as the interceptor would let him. Rather than turn south, he fled north and landed somewhere near Kamal, the town at the southwestern tip of the island of Medora, immediately opposite Surabaya's naval base on the north quay of the harbor, separated by only 2 miles of water. His escape could only be explained by the incredible climbing ability of the interceptor and excellent pilot skills. The fourth aircraft of the flight was that of Dick Dekker. Dekker was either a Tweede Luitenant or a Vandrich. Neither his CNIL enrollment record nor his Stamboek entry have any notation as to when he was promoted. I believe he was promoted either just before the Dutch surrender or after the fall of the Indies. Regardless, Dekker's aircraft had mechanical problems and was delayed by several minutes. You would perhaps have the most awkward experience of the day. As Decker climbed to altitude, he spotted the Vickers fighters ahead of him and went to join their formation. The 3 Japanese Zero pilots were likely just as surprised as Decker must have been when he realized that he was joining the wrong party.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
Decker opened fire on the lead Zero with all of his guns and peeled off to escape. The other 2 Zeros quickly turned and returned fire, joined by the other Japanese fighters in the vicinity. Decker was now swarmed by Japanese fighters, and he had no choice but to escape. At full throttle, he dodged the Zeros as best he could, running his rudder from one side to the other, Japanese bullets whizzing by his aircraft. Japanese fire eventually struck his engine, and then bullets tore into his oil tank, spewing hot oil into the cockpit. But with the Japanese fighters behind him, no sight of his squadron mates, and with a damaged engine, he turned around and headed to the northeast, still taking machine gun fire from what Zeros managed to pursue him. The incredible climbing ability of the Interceptor came into play for Decker as well, as he pulled into a near vertical climb towards cloud cover to escape the Zeros. He reached Angels 12 before his engine seized from a lack of oil. Feathering his propeller, he slipped into a near vertical dive that took him out of the range of the remaining Japanese fighters thousands of feet below him, and largely returning to their escort duties. Pulling up in low altitude, Decker directed his nimble but powerless aircraft towards the soft beaches on the south coast of Madura Island. They safely brought the crippled Interceptor onto the sands in what was a near-perfect crash landing. He was finally free from the nightmare into which he had put himself, and unharmed, he was fit to fly again. August Wilhelm Hamming was late to the fight as well. Though he was on liberty that day, he returned to base the moment he heard the sirens wail. Taking off in one of the reserve interceptors, he could not locate the others. However, he did find a nest of Zeros. He joined the furball and fired a few bursts at the Zekes before thinking better of his odds and hightailing it out of the area. Rather than returning to his besieged home turf, he flew west and landed safely at Masbate Field outside Marion. Interestingly, Hamming would become the Netherlands' first crop-dusting pilot. Unfortunately, he did not live long after the war and was killed in an accident in 1950 at the age of 35. He was flying a Telegraph Oster outside of Noord-Oostpolder in what is today Flevoland. And on the very same day, his mother had arrived from his native East Indies. One group that did find the bombers and successfully intercept them were the 8 Curtiss Hawk 75A Saturns, flown by the 1st Afdeling, 4th Flying Group, out of Marion. They engaged the unescorted G3Ms of the Takeo Kokutai over Arosbaya on the northwest shore of Madoran. 1 Nell was claimed destroyed, though none were missing that day, and several were damaged. Unfortunately, the escorts soon arrived, and the Zeros quickly downed 5 of the Hawks. 3 pilots survived, but the 2 pilots lost were a significant blow to the unit. Andrich Jonker Frederick Jacques van der Dostebay was shot down over Surabaya flying C-325. The second loss that day was the commanding officer, Captain Max Willem van der Poel, who was shot down while flying C-323. Records indicate he was shot down over Marion, but the circumstances of his death show that he was likely shot down over Surabaya. I say this because, having bailed out of his aircraft successfully, he unfortunately died a horrible death by drowning. The American 17th Pursuit at Blimbing had scrambled 8 P-40s in 2 flights that day. The unit had been set up to launch 16 at any given time, and their relations with the Dutch, as detailed wonderfully in the Journal of the American Military History Foundation's 1944 article, Luck to the Fighters, was excellent. Once the radio opened up with the voices of the young men, Indo and Javan youths almost exclusively, each in well-hidden tracks, it was only moments before they would take off into the damp, hot air rising from the rice paddies at the edge of the grass that passed for a runway, and spiral up to altitude, hoping that at Angels 1-6 they could get a chance with the Japanese. With a full 20-minute warning, the American fighters stood the best chances that day and began to circle their patrol areas. Unfortunately, the first wave of bombers was already returning to base. While awaiting the next waves of Betties and Nells, one element of two P-40s had to return to base for lack of fuel. First contact would be made by A Flight, and the two P-40s went after a flight of 17 bombers at Angels 20. Both piloted by veterans of the Philippines, the pair of P-40s pressed the attack and scored the only bomber of the day, a Betty downed by Lieutenant, later Captain, William Bill Hennon. B Flight went after two Vicks of Zeke fighters headed for the bomber base at Singosari, just north of Malang. With an 8,000-foot advantage, Lieutenants Walter Cross and James Big Jim Rowland, another Luzon veteran, dove on the Zekes only to then be jumped by his second half-dozen fighters, diving from cloud cover above and behind. Both men were quickly shot down. Lieutenant Rowland claimed a Japanese 0, but Japanese records would not account for this. It is more likely that Rowland damaged a 0, and lightly at that. Cross claimed a Japanese Seversky-type fighter, though this may have been a Babs, as one never returned to base. They had a fixed undercarriage, and even in 1943 the Americans thought the Babs was only in Army use. Plus, in 1941 and 42, nobody knew anything about Japanese aircraft, and names were largely meaningless. So it was most likely a Babs that Cross shot down, rather than the Seversky A8B. The bombers on Java would also be dealt a deadly hand by the Japanese. The Tainan Air Group Zeros added to the disaster as they struck at Singosari just north of Malang. As mentioned earlier, the American heavy bombers could not be placed in the revetments due to their size, and this would prove deadly. 4 B-17s were preparing for takeoff on their way to join the 9 bombers that had earlier that morning sortied to strike at the Japanese assets in the Makassar Strait. In quick succession, 3 fortresses exploded with fury when Japanese cannon rounds hit home on the full fuel tanks and loaded bomb bays, instantly turning the runway into an inferno of carnage and destruction. A 4th B-17 was close enough to be damaged beyond repair, and soon she too would burst into flames. There was nothing to do to save the stricken craft. She would continually catch fire several times during the day until little was left of her. Level bombers and strafing fighters continued to attack the base until 11:15. The all-clear was sounded at 11:30. While Japanese bombers had largely missed their target, the strafing Zeros had more than made up for this, and had dealt a deadly blow to the American bomber force. Some confusion here exists in the American War Diary regarding dive bombs. The American War Diary records strafing attacks by about 9 enemy dive bombers 97, with belly tanks painted light gray with a red ball insignia. These are likely Zeros, as no Vals were engaged in the fight, nor did the Val variants at the time have provisions for a drop tank. In fact, there were no Vals in the theater. The A6M was the only armed, single-engined plane to take part in the battle. This kind of confusion is to be expected. After all, Allied intelligence on Japanese air assets was practically non-existent. The first field manual with images of the Val and of 2 types of Zero, neither of which is correct, would not even come out for another month, so these reports can be discounted. Further weakening Allied strength that day was the loss of 3 of the American B-17s sent over the Makassar Strait. Their target was ostensibly the 20 transports, 3 cruisers, and 10 destroyers at Balikpapan, which had been sighted on Sunday, 1st of February, in port. Poor weather meant that the American bomber crews had no idea whether or not they had even come close to hitting any enemy ships whatever, or if any had even been spotted. Of the 9 bombers that had set off at 0905 that morning, 6 returned. At least 2 were shot down by Japanese fighters, who then strafed the helpless parachuting aircrew, killing 2. Another, B-17 41-2469, piloted by Lieutenant Swanson, suffered an engine fire in the attack and had to crash land on Aaron's Island. In another B-17, a private first-class Lowy died of suffocation. The bombers claimed a Zero shot down, but there's no correlating Japanese record. The Japanese bombers had better luck in spotting a fleet underway, namely the Allied task force preparing to sail into the Makassar Strait. The first air group's bombers under Lieutenant Commander Takeo reported at 1360 hours of ships at anchor off Madura. 2 battleships, Class A cruiser, 2 Class B cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The force was actually 4 cruisers led by the flagship, the Dutch cruiser the Wright, escorted by 3 Amiralen-class destroyers and 4 Clemson-class destroyers. The day had been costly. The ML-KNIL had lost 2 Hawk pilots, including a commanding officer, and 3 interceptor pilots, Volgenis, Halberstadt, and Van Balen. Brouwer and Bidet were severely wounded and rendered hors de combat, whilst Roomemperor had minor wounds. Materially, 5 Hawks and 7 interceptors were lost, plus Roomemperor's interceptor was damaged beyond repair and sent to the workshops at Malspati to be cannibalized. The Catalinas had been sunk in the harbor at Surabaya's seaplane base, Marina Vliegkampero Krimbogen, together with 13 Dutch flying boats and floatplanes. The base was compactly built, and the bombers did severe damage to shore facilities, especially warehouses and repair sheds, as fuel and oil created an inferno across the base. The American 17th Pursuit at Blimbing lost 2 downed aircraft and 1 pilot, leaving only 11 P-40s remaining in the squadron. The 7th Bomb Group lost a total of 7 B-17s, 4 on the ground and 3 in aerial combat. A single B-18 Bolo was shot down over Surabaya. This early model B-18, serial number 36-338, of which there is no photograph or moving picture, had been one of those which flew the 27th Bomb Squadron pilots to Australia from the Philippines. That morning it was carrying commanding officer of the 11th Bombardment Squadron and acting commander of the 7th Bomb Group, and thus of all bombers on Java, Major Austin Straubel, as well as communications and early warning systems expert Colonel William Murphy, and several passengers. Straubel was on his way back from a meeting with General Brereton and was dropping off radar specialists at Surabaya on the way. Straubel was flying with Lieutenant Russell Smith as his co-pilot. No warning of the Japanese attack had been radioed to the men, and they met Japanese fighters 30 miles west of Surabaya, just as he was descending to prepare for his landing approach. Straubel and Smith both tried in vain to rescue the passengers caught in the twisted metal of the Bolo, and suffered severe burns in addition to their injuries from the crash. Smith died just after midnight, and Straubel died of his wounds at 0300 hours that night, the last member of the flight to pass. Thus, there were no survivors. With them went early warning, radar, interception, and bombing expertise sorely needed in the early days of the war, especially on Java. Straubel and 7 other Americans would be buried in Surabaya on 4th February by the Reverend W. Patterson, a 67-year-old Protestant missionary who had lived and worked in the East Indies for some time. Alongside Straubel, being Jim Rowland, the P-40 pilot shot down, was also put to rest. Colonel Murphy was not mentioned in the articles, and it is likely he was buried alongside his brothers by one of the many Catholic priests in the area. On the Allied side, the total losses for the day were thus 5 Curtiss Hawks, 7 Curtiss Wright Interceptors, 2 Curtiss P-40s, as well as 7 Boeing B-17s, 3 consolidated Catalinas, and 13 other flying boats and floatplanes, including several Dornier DO-24Ks, all in under 1 hour. Of the 25 Allied fighters sent aloft, 15 were shot down or otherwise rendered hors de combat. Meanwhile, the press underreported as per usual. A strike by 26 bombers escorted by swarms of fighter planes was said to have struck Surabaya, while the Allies kept a Japanese invasion armada bottled up in the Strait of Makassar. Marines defeating a Japanese landing on Bataan, and the readiness of Singapore to repel anything the Japanese might throw at her, rounded out the right side of the New York Times front page on the morning of the 4th. If only those stories had been the truth. For the Japanese, the mission was a total success. Every target was hit, and the damage inflicted was certainly significant. In return, 3 Zeros and 1 Betty were lost. All 3 Zeros lost were shot down by Curtiss Wright interceptors and were from the 3rd Kokutai. Petty Officer 2nd Class Hatsumasa Yamaya and Petty Officers 3rd Class Shoichi Soji and Masaru Morita. These account for the 2 kills by Lieutenant Kinma and the kill by Sergeant Haya. 3 more Zeros suffered moderate damage, and one of the 2 C5M BAPS planes failed to return to Balikpapan, which I'd mentioned earlier. The Tainan Air Group reported no damage to any of their aircraft from enemy fire. 1 Zero crashed due to mechanical failure or a pilot error, and that was the only damage taken that day by them. The final scoreboard of the day was clearly in favor of the Japanese, though not to the extent they claimed. The 3rd Kokutai claimed 37 kills, 2 probables, and 19 heavily damaged, including 15 interceptors shot down. In addition, the 3rd Kokutai's claims included 3 Curtiss Hawk 75s, 4 Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, 9 Brewster Buffaloes, 4 Hawker Hurricanes, and 4 flying boats destroyed, as well as a B-17 and 4 flying boats seriously damaged, and 14 flying boats set ablaze. Tainan Air Group's 17 Zeros claimed 2 planes shot down and 4 destroyed on the ground at Marion, and a damaged B-17, a damaged twin-engine flying boat, 5 4-engine aircraft of an unknown type damaged, a twin-engine plane damaged, and a small plane damaged or set ablaze at Malan. I read there are some misidentifications here, but the carnage was certainly great, if not to the extent that the Japanese so characteristically claimed. Let's just look at the fighters claimed by the 3rd Kokutai, since Tainan Air Group's claims were minimal, though the 5 4-engined aircraft may have been the B-17. It's interesting to note that the Japanese specifically described Curtiss Wright or Curtiss fighters. The terms interceptor or CW-21 were not mentioned in combat reports, but this is hardly surprising. As 8 interceptors were destroyed or damaged beyond repair, and only 2 escaped damage of any kind, one can see how the number 15 may have seemed correct to the pilots engaged that day, unsure of who downed whom, and perhaps mistaking one damaged in combat that would later be destroyed on the ground as being 2 separate aircraft. The Hawk and the P-40 were known to the Japanese, and they were easy to recognize, especially in American markings so far as the P-40 was concerned. Since only 3 Hawks were claimed, but 5 were actually lost and 2 damaged, the Buffaloes mentioned are likely misidentifications, thanks to the Hawk's radial engines, comparatively stocky build, and Dutch markings, though 9 Buffaloes is certainly a gross exaggeration. The Hurricanes may have been the Hawk 75s as well, due to their Dutch rather than American or British markings, even though no Dutch Hurricanes were in service, although these also may have been mistaken interceptors. As for the second pair of P-40s, they may have been no more than shared kills or a case of over-reporting, something endemic to the Japanese, especially in the CBI and Southwest Pacific. The Curtiss Wrights and Curtiss fighters discussed as distinct from the P-40 or Hawk 75 are indubitably the CW-21B Interceptors. Given their prevalence in the press, the number of spies and collaborators on the ground, and the coverage in newspapers since the plane's first flight, it can only be presumed the Japanese knew of the tiny tadpole-shaped fighter and could identify and recognize her easily. In the 1943 publication, Anatomies of Enemy Aircraft, and I'm sorry that this is the best and only image that I could find, CW-21 was listed as a primary combat aircraft, so she certainly made an impression, whatever and whenever that happened to be the case. Back in 1942, even the Italians seemed to think, or at least pretend, that they were shooting down CW-21Bs. As to the quantity of victories claimed, Japanese claims are perhaps the most confusing to decipher and the most exaggerated in the history of air warfare. The Japanese focus on dogfight tactics, World War I style wild maneuvering, and the Japanese pilots lacking any sort of gun camera footage only increased confusion and reduced reliability. The company Rokuo-sha, which was later the Konishiruko and is now Konica, made gun cameras and camera guns. But these were designed to be used exclusively in gunnery training and mock dogfighting, never in combat. They were bulky, they hindered aerodynamics, and they were basically restricted just to training. Thus, there was no record in any way of combat except in the memories of those who returned to base. Additionally, whereas the Allies and the European Axis had medals, kill counts, and mentions in dispatches, the Japanese hierarchy largely saw such things as degenerate vanity and showboating. Therefore, individual kills were not as celebrated in Japanese military culture, except between pilots themselves. And at that level, boasting and exaggeration was a part of their camaraderie. The Japanese pilot most likely to have had the most kills that day, and someone who exemplifies the confusion in Japanese records, appears to be Warrant Officer Sadaaki Akamatsu, an ace who had survived the war flying the A5M Claude, A6M 2, 3, and 5 Zeke, and G2M Jack over China, the Philippines, Australia, India, and finally in the defense of Tokyo. He claimed to have shot down on the 3rd a total of 5 CW-21s, a seaplane of unknown type, and 2 P-40s. He was officially credited with 2 Curtiss interceptors, a seaplane or float plane of some type, and 2 P-40s. It is likely that Akamatsu is to account for the greatest casualties inflicted on the interceptors that day, if nothing else. False P-40 kills attributed to him were likely interceptors, meaning he was responsible for 4 of the CW-21s lost that day. Captain Kurosawa Tsuyoshi was strafing float planes when an aircraft Akamatsu thought was a P-40 jumped on Tsuyoshi's tail. Akamatsu got on the fighter 7 o'clock and opened fire, chasing it inland and eventually bringing it down. Since P-40s were not active at low levels anywhere that day, especially not over Surabaya, and the Hawks were intercepted much further west, the only fighter that it could have been was the CW-21B Interceptor. In my earlier reconstruction, I used the Dutch accounts of the battle to show what happened to Kingma's flight. Akamatsu's account, another picture arises. What is most likely and clearest is that Akamatsu shot down Lieutenant Kingma and possibly engaged all 4 aircraft of his flight, and that fits his combat report and those of the other pilots very well. It also fits with Dutch reports in terms of timing, altitude, and current events. He would have dived on Hogeness and destroyed him outright, missed the tightly turning Halberstadt with 1 burst, then finished Halberstadt off after getting the deadly deflection shot that was reported. After this, he likely saw Kingma diving toward Tsuyoshi, who was engaged strafing the naval base that was below Kingma's flight. This part is most certain. Kingma had already downed 2 fighters and was approaching a 3rd from high and behind. The altitude and position of the 3rd Zero is unknown, and it may very well have been Tsuyoshi and Kingma's sights, as this is the only instance of an interceptor successfully getting behind a Zero in that vicinity that day. Akamatsu then earned his 3rd victory before Kingma could get his 3rd kill. Turning back towards his flight, Akamatsu would then have been in a perfect position to inflict damage on Haya, possibly already damaged and known to be at a lower altitude by that time. Akamatsu would then climb back and join in the strafing attacks against the seaplane base. Severely damaged and with oil covering the canopy and fluid leaking from everywhere, Akamatsu likely thought that he shot Haya down. Against such a pilot and his protégés, the interceptor stood little chance. This video clip here of Akamatsu seated in his G2M Jack Comes from the last, if not the second to last, newsreel of the war from Japan. His flight instructor in 1931 was the most famous Minoru Genda, and he trained with his famous Yokozuka Air Group in 1934, devising many of the tactics used by the Japanese Navy for the following 11 years. Akamatsu claimed 350 kills, with 242 or 243 being over China. And not that this is a realistic figure. There's probably more aircraft than there even were in China during his time there. And he was officially credited with 38 kills or 23 kills, only 11 of which, or 4 of which respectively, were in China. The lower numbers appear to be his confirmed unshared kills. So it was likely 38 kills, of which 23 were his alone. It is worth noting that his victories were against fighters in his whole career, with the exception of the seaplane with which he was credited on 3rd February. Akamatsu never once lost a dogfight, and he was only hit by enemy rounds on 5 occasions. He was considered by his peers to be amongst the best skilled Japanese fighter pilots of both the China and Pacific Wars. And on top of all of that, he was renowned as an accomplished swimmer and martial artist, holding the combined rank of 15th Dan in Judo, Kendo, Kyudo, and Sumo. Yet at the same time, he was infamous for flying in a state of near inebriation, never flying sober if he could help it, and of being a bit more than a maverick, a fan of practical jokes, and the opposite of nearly everything a Japanese soldier was supposed to embody at that time. His promotion from petty officer to warrant officer, and eventually his commission and promotion to Lieutenant JG, were surprises to everyone, probably even himself. I highly, highly recommend his memoirs, not only for their historical value, but also for the sheer enjoyment of what I can only describe as a combination of very un-Japanese bravado, hubris, and chauvinism. And you can always use a translator, like I did, to read them. By explaining the man and his career and his actions on that day, we can appreciate what the Dutch were up against in this very one-sided fight. As twilight gave way to night at 1710 hours, the remains of the day were gathered, and unit-level reports were forwarded, each side's chain of command being informed of the maelstrom of lead and steel which had engulfed eastern Java. As far as the Japanese were concerned, the day was an incredible victory. Allied air strength had been decimated, the Allied fleet was spotted, and harbor assets were ablaze. The Japanese wasted no time in assessing the battle. Even before the evening fell, Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara had already ordered a nocturnal probe of the Surabaya area, followed by a pre-dawn search, all in preparation for a strike by land-based planes on the 4th. His bomber crews would have no rest. He had grabbed the Allies' tail, and he was not going to let go. At 2100 hours, the first Kokutai launched a single bomber, but it was forced to return to base due to a faulty radio. The task fell to 2 H-6K Mavis flying routes of the Toko Kokutai, based at Kendari. With the unpredictable weather delaying them, they would not take off until 0045 hours and 0115 hours, respectively. At 0150 hours, the commander of the 11th Air Fleet, Admiral Tsukahara, filed his report on the combat of the day. Expanding even farther on the claims of his units, he counted 62 aircraft shot down or destroyed on the ground, and 23 or 24 probables, for a total of 85 Allied aircraft, a strength the Dutch could only wish they started with. The Allied reports to commands far from the inferno Java had become were almost too brief. Perhaps they did not want any true figure concerning their losses reaching Japanese ears. More likely, the Allies had no true picture as of yet regarding what had hit them. Most importantly, brevity spoke to the urgency at hand. Abdakhan reported, attacks on Surabaya and Malang Aerodrome first results have moved south of enemy air strength. Bombers could have come from Balikpapan. Fighters either from same place or from carrier in Java Sea. Abtecom's commander of American forces, Lieutenant General George Brett, was much more to the point in his wire from his headquarters at Lembang, outside Bandung. The Sea Asiatic Fleet forwarded his brief and his emergent request addressed to Commanding Officer, Hawaiian Detachment, U.S. Army, and repeated to Cairo, Aguad, Washington, D.C., and Melbourne. Surabaya has been attacked. Forward all airplanes immediately. Signed, Brett. And that takes us through the 3rd of February, 1942. I hope you enjoyed this. It is obviously a long time in coming. The video is, I hope, something that you all enjoy. And while there is a lot there that's not directly related to the CW-21, I think that giving an overview of the situation that they faced speaks much more to the pilot's abilities and to the combat performance and capabilities of the Interceptor. Moving into the next video, which I intended this all to be one video, not a two-parter, but I think this video is long enough. We'll follow the next few days with 2 VLG-4 as Java falls to the Japanese in the beginning of March. Because of the research and everything that went into this, I discovered a lot of documents that are not available online, which now are. Of course, my thanks go out to basically anybody and everyone that helped. Especially, I want to give thanks to the Dutch National Archives. You'll see also that a lot of the things I discovered, they uploaded, which is nice. I mean, I requested it. And it seems that when you request things from them and they find them, they then upload them to their own sites. At the National Institute of Military History. Also, the Australian War Memorial. The United States National Archives. And friends of mine who just did some legwork. My Patreon patrons and channel members. I mean, you guys really make just everything possible, from paying for software subscriptions and merchandise, of course, is always available if you want to chip in towards that. And finally, I just want to say that on my Patreon page, you can go in there and see everything that went into this video. Videos, documents, photos, all of it's going to be in there for your perusal, and some things that didn't make it into here. So there's going to be plenty in there about this wonderfully obscure little aircraft, which frankly now I kind of want to be done with. Like I said, just the one video left. And after that, I want to go into Luftwaffe at sea and the Coast Guard. So those are my next 2 projects to return to. Thank you to everyone. And as always, my name is Claire, and I am the Warbird Mistress. Take care.